Chapter 32. An hour before dawn, Joshua came out to the courtyard. We'd raised the last golem. There were 7 of them, and I knew from one look at Joshua's face that we would not have time for an 8th. Time to go to the gate, he said. Duchess is already there, arranging the troops. Mona, he stopped there, because if he kept talking, he would have had to ask a 14-year-old girl to come to the front lines of a battle, and he hated it. And he knew he had to do it, and I knew I had to come because somebody had to tell the golems what to do. This is a lot to not actually say. I hunched my shoulders and I said, yeah, let's go. We loaded the wagons with leftover dough. There was still a lot of it, maybe 2 wagons full, although Our Lady of Sorrowful Angels only knew what I was going to do with it at the front lines without an oven. Still, we brought it. Between the wagons, bringing their barrel-shod feet down with a sound like gigantic hoofbeats, walked the golems. They were staying upright. That gave me hope. Each one of them carried a fence post in one hand to use as a club. Argonel had offered to commandeer the huge ceremonial axe that the Duchess's very remote ancestors had used to chop the heads off bulls. I declined. On the one hand, an axe takes a lot more brains to work than a club, and on the other, I still felt kind of bad for all the ancestral bulls. Aunt Tabitha had put an icing face on each one, though the later golems did not have angry eyebrows, and the last 3 didn't even have mouths. Still, there was no one else in the streets, so we reached the gate just as that odd, greyish-brown light that precedes dawn was starting to seep over the walls. On our side of the big gate was one of the largest squares in the city. It had to be to accommodate all the wagons and carts coming in, and to give them a space to turn so they can get to their particular roads. 4 roads led into it, not including the one through the gate, 2 running parallel to the walls, 2 coming in at angles on the far side from the gate. All but one of those roads had been blockaded with overturned wagons and wooden barricades. They weren't pretty. They looked like a cross between a furniture shop and a hedgehog. There were chairs and beds and big wooden planks nailed haphazardly to fill in the gaps, and some of them had sandbags piled up at the bottom or wedged in between the chairs. Spears bristled out of all of them. The golems could look down on all of them. The enemy were going to have to climb. We have recruits manning the spears on the other side of each barricade, said Joshua quietly, and every archer in the city is either on the wall or on top of the buildings circling this square. We have to hold them here, or they'll get into the city and it'll be house to house. He didn't have to say any more. I could imagine what it would be like, huddling in your basement, hearing the doors being forced, and then men with swords bursting in, and we'll put the golems in the square then, I said briskly, rubbing my palms together. The fingers of my left hand had been slathered in honey, which is good for burns, and wrapped in gauze. They throbbed in time to my heartbeat. Joshua nodded. They'll be waiting when the carracks break through the gate. Not if, I noticed. When. If they're able to drive them back through the gate, do so. I nodded. I had, in a large bowl, 7 lumps of half-cooked dough, which I had pulled from each golem. Argonel had found some paint, and each golem had a drippy armband in a different colour, which was also splashed on the bread, so theoretically I would be able to control each golem individually with the magic of sympathy. It had worked getting them to march. We hadn't had more than a few minutes to test it, though, and I had no idea how well it was going to work with complex orders. The golems were dumb, even for bread, and I was so tired. I'd lost more than half of the bad cookies by now. I'd managed to grab 10 and 20-minute catnaps while the golems cooked, but every time a bad cookie went, I jerked awake again. Nothing like that had happened with the other baked goods, probably because I always pulled the magic out of them before they got eaten or destroyed or whatever. It was a nasty feeling. Exhaustion was starting to creep around the edges of my vision like grey mould. When the golems were settled, the last road was barricaded up. The wagons that had brought us here were unloaded and turned on their sides. Soldiers dragged out big wooden barriers. I recognized barn doors from the paint and braced them between buildings. Argonel, I said as the barricade went up, leaving him on the other side with the dough and a dozen replacement barrels. It's been an honour, Wizard Mona, he said, smiling down at me. Don't worry. Thanks, Argonel, I said, for, all of it. He nodded. We didn't say anything more because I was pretty sure if I said too much more, I was going to start crying, and maybe he would have too. I don't know. Wooden planks filled up the space between us. How do we get out? I asked Joshua. He nodded to ladders laid against the wall. We'll pull them up once the fighting starts. Shall we go up now? Harold came up the ladder behind me, and Aunt Tabitha came up behind him. I could hear the archers shifting and talking quietly on the roof. Somebody told a joke. Somebody else laughed. One sharp bark. The view from the top of the wall was of darkness, broken by the red glow of Carrick's campfires. I could see shadows of men moving, but nothing more. The Duchess was waiting at the top of the wall. She was wearing armour. When she saw me, she smiled. Mona, my dear. Her smile faded. Can we not find armour for her? Mona's not trained to fight in armour, said Joshua. Even if she was, we don't have much for young girls. He nodded to an aide, a tall man standing just within earshot. Kryn, run over to the armoury, see what you can find for the wizard and her aunt. Aunt Tabitha laughed. I suspect you'd have an easier time fearing Mona. The Duchess reached out and took Tabitha's arm and said, Madam, we will not lose you or your niece, who have done so much for us, to a stray arrow or a misplaced bow. Aunt Tabitha, who had lost much of her fear of the monarchy in the last day or so, actually patted the Duchess's hand and said, Don't worry, Your Grace, it will take a great deal to get rid of me. Someone must make sure that you all wizards and warriors remember to eat. Another of the bad cookies winked out. I was down to 10. I wondered if they'd done anything beyond leaving me tired enough to curl up right here on the stone wall and take a nap. Where is Spindle? Is he out there in the dark? Did he make it back inside the walls? Did he do something stupid? My little gingerbread cookie was still out there somewhere too. I didn't know where. I didn't have anything to track him with, like the bad cookies, but I was sure I'd feel it if he vanished. Should the Duchess be up here? I asked Joshua in an undertone. I mean, if they get into the city. The Duchess had very, very sharp ears. She came and leaned on the battlements next to me. I could hide in the palace, she said. There are very thick doors. I could spend the next 2 days cowering in a dark room while my people die, waiting for the doors to finally be broken down and the Carricks to come for me. I have cowered enough these last few months. I find that I fear that dark room more than I fear dying out here, in the open air. What will happen if we lose? I asked. The Duchess sighed. If he has control over the Carricks, then Oberon will take me prisoner, and most likely have me executed immediately after a trial designed to convince the nobles that we are still under the rule of law, and they can continue pretty much as they always have. You, well, it is hard to say, my dear, but you have been a threat and a nuisance to him, and I suspect that he will have you executed if he can catch you. She tilted her head. If he does not have control over the Carricks, then we will mostly die once they break through our defences. I nodded. It was about what I had expected. Then my knees went weak and wobbly, and I could feel my stomach churning. Well, I didn't say anything about it. The Duchess had put on that royal mask again, being strong and competent and inspiring, and I really didn't want to whimper in front of her.
Thanks, Jax.
Thank you, Jax. You'll have to go through me, growled Aunt Tabitha. And us as well, said Joshua dryly. I doubt that will be a problem once the city's breached. There's simply not enough of us. The runner arrived with his arms full of leather and chain. As Joshua had predicted, there was very little that fit me. I had to settle for a leather cap and a heavy vest, made out of leather with metal bits sewn to it that Joshua said was usually worn by the drummer boy. Actually wasn't too bad. It felt a bit like the apron I wore at work, just heavier, and at least my arms were still free. Aunt Tabitha, on the other hand, got a full suit of chainmail. A lot of guards are big. They generally aren't big in the same places Aunt Tabitha is big, but she made it work. It was frighteningly appropriate. If she hadn't been a baker, Aunt Tabitha would probably have been one of those northern warrior women with the big breastplates that sing opera and carry off the souls of the valiant dead. While they were outfitting her, I went back to staring out at the Carrick's camp. When is something going to happen? I asked Joshua. Things have been happening all night, he said. One of the big cook tents went up in flames a few hours ago. They had some trouble with the horses. I assume it's the men that Spindle told us about, harassing them. I grinned. Spindle's friends, or maybe a pack of really bad cookies. They should attack at dawn, said Joshua, as my grin faded, or as soon as it's light enough to see. The attack came 20 minutes after sunrise. Aunt Tabitha said it had been 20 minutes anyway. She's got a pretty good internal clock. Always knows when the muffins are ready to pull out of the oven. Didn't feel like 20 minutes. Felt like 20 years. The sky looked like a raw egg, runny with streaks of red in it. They're forming up, said Harold, standing with us on the battlements. Joshua had gone to address the archers off on the left side of the wall. I couldn't really tell what was going on, to be honest with you. Except that the milling carracks were milling more or less in our direction and forming into a very, very large crowd, aiming our way. It looked more like the crowd you get when the circus comes to town than anything military. And then they started to move towards the wall. "Archers!" cried a voice, and "Archers! Archers! Archers!" ran along the top of the wall as the officers picked up the cry and passed it down. On either side of our little knot, men with bows stepped forwards and knocked arrows onto strings. "Hold!" cried the voice. "Hold! Hold! Hold!" The carracks broke into a run. "Steady," murmured Harold to no one in particular. "Steady. Steady, wait until they're in range." It seemed to take forever. I wanted them to fire and get it over with, shoot the people coming at us waving swords and axes, and I didn't even know what that was. It looked like a bull with spikes on it. Who carries around a bull with spikes on it? But the archers held and held and held, and then fire! Arrows rained down with a hiss like butter on the griddle, magnified 100 times. It didn't do anything. Well, I'm sure it did something. I heard some carracks scream and a few fell down, but if there were any gaps in the crowd, they filled in immediately, and that was extremely discouraging. There was another volley. The carracks' army continued to run towards us. There were so many of them, the ones in back hadn't even left their camp yet. They could afford to throw waves at us, while the rest sat around the campfire and toasted marshmallows, and this struck me as just desperately unfair. They could at least pretend we were dangerous, out of common courtesy. "Slings!" shouted the voice down the wall. "Slings! Slings!" The archers stepped back and drew more arrows. 50 fighters, none of them guards. I saw women. I saw a few kids older than me, carrying leather slings, stepped forward, fitting jars full of angry Bob into their weapons, and began to twirl them above their heads. "This is it, Bob." I thought hard at my favourite sourdough. "This is your big moment. I hope you're good and mad." It was an awkward fit. Sling stones are usually a lot smaller than jars. A couple of them fell out and smashed on the wall. A few more failed to get more than a few feet beyond the wall. But the majority sailed into the ranks of the carracks with the crisp sounds of shattering glass. That they noticed. Part of it was the simple fact that if you get clocked over the head with a jar, you tend to pay attention. But Bob was angry, and he'd had all night to stew in his own juices, both literally and metaphorically. The carracks who got hit by jars found themselves with a furious, slimy mass that burned like acid, and which was trying to crawl under their armour. There was a lot more yelling. Gaps opened up in the line as individual carracks stopped running and started trying to yank their armour off to get at the Bobs. Other men slowed down to see why their comrades were yelling and stripping off in the middle of a battlefield, and some of them got hit by stray bits of Bob, which immediately tried to go up their noses. "Get 'em, Bob!" cheered Aunt Tabitha next to me. "Show those filthy mercenaries what for!" "Slings! Slings! Slings!" The second wave of Bob hit the enemy. Given how much chaos he was causing, I was starting to wish I'd spent less time on golems and more on making wheelbarrows full of Bob. I still had a jar with me and a half bucket or so back at the palace, so if we held them for a full day and they retreated at night, I might be able to whip up something else. The slingers stepped back, and the archers, who had picked up fresh quivers, stepped forwards. The gaps in the enemy line that Bob had opened got bigger as the archers fired, and the crowd that finally surged against the gate was ragged in places. I expected them to fill in, but they didn't. Some of the mercenaries that had gotten a faceful of Bob were down, and nobody wanted to get too close to them. Bob was fully capable of jumping if he was angry enough. He'd almost pounced on one of the guards moving barrels earlier. The downed mercenaries were twitching a bit, but that was all. I felt sick. On the one hand, I hated them for burning the fields, for attacking my city, for working for Oberon. But still, death by sourdough starter, that is not a good way to go. You had to feel sorry for them, and I was the one who brought it about. If you just leave, I thought, if you just turn around and leave, none of this would have to happen. The ranks of Carracks opened. A man on a horse rode down the aisle they formed. Behind him were two more men, also one for horses, one carrying a white flag. Now for the farce, muttered the Duchess. I suppose it's too much to hope that they're surrendering, I said. Far too much. I believe that's Oberon. It was. The former Inquisitor rode until he stood perhaps 20 feet from the wall and looked up. The horseman, who wasn't carrying a flag, rode even closer. Some kind of herald, murmured Harold. And definitely Oberon. Shoot him, I hissed, practically hopping up and down. We've got archers. Shoot him. Shoot him a lot. He's under a white flag, said the Duchess wearily. You don't shoot people with white flags. But it's Oberon. Believe me, Mona, I am entirely sympathetic to your feelings. But we don't shoot people with white flags in hopes that someday, if we're under a white flag, they will return the favour. Rules of warfare. His Lordship Oberon, Inquisitor of the city, would address the traitor Duchess, shouted the herald. His voice was loud and carried across the walls. Men along the wall booed. The Duchess rolled her eyes and stepped up to the battlement. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, If Oberon wants a traitor, he should look in the mirror. I am the Duchess, rightful ruler of this city. The men cheered. The herald's horse sidled and stamped its feet. His Lordship makes you the following offer. That you now, at once, open the city and lay down your arms. That all aggression against our Carracks allies ceases. That the Duchess be handed over. I could save you the trouble, called Joshua from further down the wall. His Lordship can stuff it in his arse. We will never surrender, shouted the Duchess. We will never submit to the rule of a traitor backed by hired killers. We will fight for our city to the last man. Great waves of cheering broke over the walls. Men waved their swords and bows in the air. Under the chorus, the Duchess muttered, at least not until sometime this afternoon, when it's that or have the city burned down around our ears. Aunt Tabitha snorted. The herald turned and rode away. Thank you. Marriage was absolutely what I was going for. Thank you for picking up what I was putting down. Chapter Marriage. Chapter 33. The Duchess caught my eye and her lips twisted in something that resembled a smile of sorts. It wouldn't help if we surrendered, Mona. The Carracks would pillage the city anyway. Oberon may think he can keep them on a leash and use them as his army, but once they're inside the walls, they will tear the city apart looking for food and gold, and then they will squat in the ruins. And when the army gets back, they'll be the ones laying siege. The best we can do is reduce their numbers and make them pay for every inch of ground they take. She sighed. The Golden General will make a good ruler. Probably a better one than me. I only pray there will be enough left for him to rule. Oberon rode away down the aisle with the herald and flag-bearer. The crowd of Carracks closed around him. I peered over the edge of the battlements. Now what do they do? None of the surrounding buildings were tall enough for them to reach the top of the wall, or anything like it. The city laws were very strict about that, and there wasn't much point in attacking a stone wall with a sword, although some of the Carracks were pounding on the wall with their sword hilts anyway. Let's try to break down the gate, said Harold. They're bringing up the battering ram now. He pointed to a thick line of men with shields over their heads to ward off arrows. They were carrying a very large log. The end of the log was a big ball of steel, moulded into the shape of a fist. Oh, it's a knocker, said the Duchess. Dear me, I knew they probably had one. I hoped I was wrong. I didn't ask why it was called a knocker. It was pretty obvious. The Carracks were going to knock on the gates, and then the Carracks were going to knock the gates down. There's an iron portcullis, isn't there? Shouldn't that hold up? Harold shook his head. Oh, it might, for a bit. The mortar won't. Something like that could knock the portcullis right out of the wall holding it, or bend it so far out of shape you can wiggle under. Thunk. The knocker hit the gate. Doesn't look like it did much. I craned my neck, trying to see. Aunt Tabitha grabbed my collar and hauled me back. Just wait, said Harold. Thunk. A faint shudder went through the stones of the wall. Thunk. 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 I really don't like this, I said to no one in particular as dust sifted down from the top of the wall. Felt like the knocker was going to bring down the whole thing, not just the gate. Me neither, said the Duchess. Thunk. Thunk. Crunch. That was a bad sound. Oh yes, scrunch. Almost through the portcullis, said Harold. I had expected the gates to last a lot longer, until mid-morning at least. We had to hold them off for 2 days minimum if the army was going to show up and save us all, and in half an hour they were most of the way to breaching the walls. This was bad. At least they're not coming over the walls, said Harold, answering my thoughts. Knockers are heavy equipment to lug around. They can't afford to drag any more siege equipment with them. The archers kept firing. The slingers flung stones. The air hissed with arrows, punctuated by the crunching thud, as the knocker chewed relentlessly at our gates. Crunch. Crunch. Every time one of the men holding the knocker fell, another ran up under a shield to take his place. I wished I had an ocean of bob to drop on their heads. Joshua ran up, jogging with his head down to stay below the knocked bowstrings of the archers. Mona, they're almost through. It'll be time for the golems in a minute. I moved to the other side of the wall, looking down into the courtyard. My ears buzzed. My feet seemed a very long way away. Yeah, I said. Yeah, of course. I picked up the bowl of dough. Crunch. Crunch. Crack. The wood splintered. The next blow went right through the gates, and I looked down and saw the metal fist of the knocker emerge into the square. Joshua had suggested the arrangement of golems, 3 in front of a semicircle around the gate, 4 in the back in a larger circle. I grabbed the 3 balls of dough in front, red, blue, and black, and thought, forward, stop those men. The golems stepped forwards. Their barrel feet clopped loudly on the stones, audible even over the shouts of the Carracks. The enemy poured through, past the men holding the knocker, into the square, and stopped. Well, I mean, to be fair, they'd probably never seen a 12-foot-tall man made out of bread before. Let alone 7 of them. The golem with the red band on its arm lifted its club and smacked the warrior in the lead on the head. He fell down. The mercenaries looked at their leader and at the golem. They did not look up at the wall, thankfully, where they might have seen a 14-year-old girl scowling ferociously into a bowl full of bread dough. Now, to give credit where credit is due, the Carracks did not stay surprised for very long. There was a reason they were the most feared mercenaries in the land. They might not use magic themselves, but they understood when they were facing it, and neither were they afraid of it. They didn't back down. Neither did the golems. Red, black, and blue swung their clubs, knocking warriors into each other, into the walls, sending them rolling across the cobblestones. I was absurdly proud. There was weight behind those blows. I'd always been impressed at the strength of the gingerbread men in relation to their size, and my golems were just as strong. They might only be made of bread, but the way they moved, they might as well have been made of stone. The first group of Carracks through the door didn't even make it past the first 3 golems. The second, rather than engage, tried to charge, and found themselves running into the arms of green, white, orange, and purple. Well, I say arms. More like the knees. The third group of Carracks paused at the gate and seemed to be having a heated discussion with one another about the best way to proceed. The archers picked off a few more. I grabbed the good ball of dough belonging to Red. Down in the square, Red dropped its club, took 2 heavy strides forward, and grabbed the end of the knocker. It couldn't quite pick the battering ram up. Even magic bread has limits, but it hauled the knocker into the square. The men on the other end yelled and squawked and hung on until they realized they were being dragged inside the walls. Having seen what had just happened to the other Carracks, they prudently let go. Red dragged the knocker inside and dumped it against one of the walls. "You know, I've always rather wanted one of those," said the Duchess. Red picked up its club in time to meet the next wave of Carracks. This time, they got smart. They went for the golem's knees just above the barrel. I imagine that they were thinking, and probably rightly, that if they could hack through the bread there, the golems would be down and helpless. It was actually a really good plan. However, as you probably know, if you've ever tried to cut a loaf of bread, you can't just stab it with a sharp knife. Stabbing it doesn't do a lot, except get your knife stuck in the crust. You need a serrated blade, and you need to saw back and forth with it to slice the loaf off. It takes a little time. I sank my fingers into the dough. Generally, when I had the cookies do this, it was a dance number to amuse the customers, but... "Are they doing the can-can?" said Harold in disbelief. "Battle can-can," said the Duchess wisely. "Very old tactical manoeuvre, used to defeat the waltzing berserkers of West Quillmark, as I recall." "You just made that up." "Well, obviously. The golems could do a pretty good high kick. It got their legs out of range of the Carracks and generally took the swords along with them. Red had a sword stuck right through its left knee, and Blue had 2 swords in the right, and Black took the prize with 3 swords and 1 axe buried partway up the thigh. Now, since Red doesn't really care if there's a knife stuck in it, this did not slow them down at all. The kicks also meant that the owners of these weapons had all just taken a high-velocity barrel to the torso and were mostly out of commission. There was a brief pause while the Carracks tried to figure out what to do next while staying out of the way of our archers. A semicircle of clear ground formed in front of the gate, and I took the opportunity to slump against the battlements. The magical weight that I seemed to be carrying around got a lot heavier when the fighting started. Even the loss of a couple more bad cookies sometime during the battle couldn't balance it out. I felt like I was trying to jog uphill carrying a backpack full of rocks. Aunt Tabitha felt my forehead. "You're flushed," she said accusingly. "And you feel hot." "Aunt Tabitha, we're having a war. I don't think I can go and have a quick lie down." She frowned. "Don't you just hurt yourself, Gil. You're the only niece I've got. And the only wizard the city's got too. The only wizard aside from knackering Molly. Wish she was here. Didn't know if it would help, but would be nice not to be the only one. And more than anything, honestly, I wish Spindle was here. I hope he's okay." A group of Carracks carrying bows came through the crowd of their fellows, which was now largely standing around, holding shields over their heads. "This is where you see the advantages of military discipline," said Harold. "Our troops will keep attacking until they brought them down through sheer force of numbers. None of the mercenaries won't be the first one through the gate." Their archers reached the front lines, knelt, and began shooting at the columns. I started laughing. Couldn't help it. Stab a bunch of toothpicks into a loaf of bread and you've got, I don't know, an appetizer or something. Not a dead golem, anyhow. Clearly the Carracks still had no idea what they were dealing with. Our archers had to lean over the edge of the battlements to shoot, but there was a minute where the Carracks shot at the golems and our men shot at the Carracks, and by the end of it, there were a lot few Carracks archers, and Red and Black looked like hedgehogs. Blue, who had been mostly shielded by the broken gate, just stood there until the foolish Carracks came along around the edge of the wall and got a face full of fence post. The archers retreated. There was more hurried discussion. This time, when they attacked, they sent twice as many men in. The 4 golems in back had to do the can-can as well, but after about 10 frantic minutes, I had a pounding headache, and the Carracks hadn't gotten anywhere. 2 or 3 had managed to get past the golems to the barricades, where they were promptly picked off by archers on the roof. I was feeling a grim sort of hope, even looking over the other side of the wall and seeing just how many Carracks remained couldn't quite squelch it. "Blue's barrel is getting pretty beaten up," said the Duchess. I nodded. "Argonel is supposed to have some spares at the wagons." I had Blue fall back. White took his place, walked Blue over to the barricade on the palace road. It was the lowest of the bunch, and Blue was able to step over it somewhat awkwardly. Seeing the number of golems diminish, the Carracks attacked again. They were beaten back, but more made it through to the barricades, and now Black was limping. A suicidally brave Carracks with an axe had actually climbed onto Black's leg and gotten a couple of solid hacks into his knee before the golem managed to detach him. "Can you heal them?" asked the Duchess. I chewed on my lower lip. "He needs patching." It's not a wound, exactly. His leg just won't hold him up all the way. I've got dough, I can fix it, but I need to be down there to make it work. Blue stepped back over the barricade and back into the fray. The Carricks retreated again. Harold and the Duchess held a brief conference. Quick, said the Duchess, before there's another wave. Down onto that roof there and around the back. Harold knows the way. Hurry. I followed Harold. Aunt Tabitha came down the ladder after us. Took us down to a roof, and there we went down the fire escape and into the streets. And it was much scarier on the ground. You couldn't see what was going on. You could just hear the dull roar of the army outside the walls. I fretted. If the Carricks attacked before we got back, the Golems could fight on their own. But if anything unexpected happened, well, Bread's not good at independent thought. If the Carricks broke through the barricades while we were on the ground, we were going to get overrun by angry people with swords, and that would be exciting for about 30 seconds, but not in a good way. It seemed to take a lot longer to go around the square than it had to cross it, even though we ran. The cobblestones were the rounded ones that looked like sweet buns. We had to be careful because they always get a bit slippery. When we finally rounded the corner and saw Arganel and the barrels, I let out a cheer. Arganel whipped round and very nearly cracked Harold over the head with his smith's hammer before he realised who it was. Oh, it's you, Mona. The Golems are doing much better than we hoped, he grinned. But what are you doing down from the walls? It's Black, I said, grabbing the black-marked doughball and ordering him to come back over the barricades. He's going to lose a leg in a minute if I don't fix him. Arganel nodded. We all scattered to the walls as Black's foot came down. He wavered for a moment. That knee was definitely going, and then caught his balance. I grabbed a glob of dough out of one of the barrels and crammed it into the wedge the axe had cut in Black's leg. I had to climb up the barrel to do it. The Carrick's axemen had been a lot taller than I was. Aunt Tabitha came up behind me and handed me several more handfuls until we managed to fill the gap. All right, I said, let's see if this works. I put my hands on either side of the raw dough and thought hard about how I wanted to fuse with the bread around it, seal up the gap, become part of the golem. It was hard. The magic of sympathy was working against me here. This dough wasn't part of the same batch. It hadn't been baked together. I was already feeling magically exhausted, and for a minute or two, nothing seemed to be happening. Come on, come on! You can do it! There was a yell from the barricade. I jerked my head up and saw that the Carricks had taken advantage of the gap in the line to charge again, and this time they kept coming and climbing. Men on the barricades were stabbing with spears to try and fend them off, but as I watched, 2 helmeted heads popped up over the top. Arganel and Harold rushed to help. The first 2 Carricks were knocked back down, but now 3 more were coming up on the sides, and one was, oh, sweet lady of sorrowful angels, one was actually over the barricade and coming this way. Aunt Tabitha yanked a hammer from the fingers of an apprentice who had turned sort of green and charged the enemy, whooping. I grabbed the dough in front of me and thought, you play nice and be a patch on this golem right bloody now. Black grunted. The patch of dough oozed into position and hardened into a flouring crust. I scrambled down just in time to see Aunt Tabitha reach the Carricks. The enemy warrior clearly had no idea what to make of the berserk woman charging at him with her house dress flapping madly over her jingling armour. He gaped at her. Aunt Tabitha whacked him with the hammer so hard that his helmet got knocked halfway around his head and he fell down. She kicked him a few times. Aunt Tabitha had very definite opinions about people who tried to invade her city. Standing up made my head spin, and for a moment I very nearly fell down myself. The magic was draining out of me in a steady drip, drip, like an untreated wound. But if Aunt Tabitha was fighting the Carricks, I didn't have time to faint. I bit my lip and thought, you stop that. The world stabilised and stopped going fuzzy and grey around the edges. I exhaled. Time to get Black back into the fray. I turned to pat him on the leg. Back you go. There's a good golem. And that pat is what saved my life. The spring green man's knife hit my shoulder at an angle instead of the back of my neck, and the point skittered off the armoured jerkin. I yelped. I wanted to scream, but a thin little yell was all that came out. Harold and Arganel and Aunt Tabitha were busy on the barricades, and there were Carricks coming up over the sides, and Black was knocking them down, but some had still gotten over, and the spring green man was lifting his knife for another blow, and that familiar, heavy, sweet smell was all around us, and he bared his teeth at me like an animal. Third time pays for all, little bread wizard, he hissed. and I knew that my luck had finally run out.
And you're all welcome I didn't pick that chapter to end the night on.
Tempted beyond words to just deadpan, and we're leaving it there for tonight.
I almost did. I almost made that the ending.
Yeah, these are chunky chapters too.
Yeah, they are.
There was something, chapter 34. There was something stuck in his teeth. Here I was, about to die, stabbed to death by a deranged wizard, and that was what I noticed. There was something green stuck in his teeth. Fortunately, the rest of my body knew what was important. My knees decided to throw me sideways, without bothering to consult my brain. I caught myself, took off at a run, sliding on the cobblestones. If I could get back to the wall, surely Joshua and the Duchess could defend me, or we could knock him off the ladder or something. He couldn't climb the ladder with a knife in his hand, right? Right? Right away I realized that I was in trouble. The weight of magic was still with me, even if I was running for my life. It was like trying to run with concrete blocks strapped to my ankles. I dropped the rest of the bad cookies ruthlessly and got a little back, but I didn't dare cut off the golems. The golems were the only thing standing between the carracks and the city. Oh God, I'm going to die. I could hear Elgar's footsteps pounding behind me. Where were the archers? Couldn't one look this way and see what was happening and kill him? And the jerkin, which had saved my life before, might kill me now. It was so hot and so heavy I couldn't seem to breathe right with it pressing down on me, and that horrible spicy smell was filling my lungs and making it even harder to breathe. Is this the street that goes back to the wall? I think this is the street. There's the building at the end, the red brick one with the fires. The spring green man grabbed my shoulder, wrenched me around, and slammed me into the wall of the nearby alley. I guess it doesn't matter now. Elgar grabbed my wrists in one hand, and you know what? It is completely and utterly unfair that when you are a 14-year-old girl, even if you have amazing forearms, your wrists are still small enough for somebody else to hold with one hand. I flailed, and I think he was surprised at how strong I was, but I didn't go anywhere except back against the brick wall. Hard. Blood thudded in my ears. He lifted the knife. The blade gleamed. The sun was shining down into the alley, and that meant it was nearly noon. We'd held out until almost noon. That was good. Right? You're not getting away from me again, Elgar said. I wasn't leaving this city until I saw you dead. I could hardly hear him over the pounding of blood in my ears and the shouting of the battle a few yards away, but I got the gist. I would have thought you'd be with Oberon, I panted. Elgar spat. That idiot. Once he took the city, I was going to kill him anyway. A wizard emperor. Just think of it. I guess really bad people all think they're using each other and being really clever about it, and they all want to be in charge. You never see them stabbing each other over who gets to be the baker. And because I was really going to die right this minute, and it didn't much matter anymore, I said, "You've got something stuck in your teeth." He blinked. I guess this is not the sort of thing that people say when you are about to stab them. What? In your teeth. Sort of green. What is wrong with you? This was an excellent question, and I was sort of wondering that myself. So anyway, the spring green man lifted the knife higher, and then something happened very fast, and something made of rag and bone sang past my face, and Elgar was flung halfway down the alley, because Nag had just kicked his head in. Apparently that thudding noise had not been my heart pounding in my ears after all. "Oh yeah!" yelled Spindle, scrambling down from behind Molly as Nag's hooves landed back on the cobbles. "That's for Tibby, you green bastard! I hope you rot!" Nag, being dead himself, did not object to Spindle jumping off his back, nor did he seem to notice when I threw my arms around one of his back legs and hugged him very much. Knackering Molly snorted. "Seems like I keep finding you in trouble, Baker Girl." "I'm alive," I moaned into Nag's hip bone. "Molly, Nag, Spindle." Spindle looked up from Elgar's limp body. "What?" "You're alive! I'm alive!" I started giggling hysterically because otherwise I was going to sit down and sob right there. "We're all alive, except Nag. I mean, other than him. We're all... Oh!" My stomach clenched. I went down to my knees and last night's dinner came all the way back up. "Ugh!" said Spindle, who had left off kicking the late Elgar and was now going through his pockets. Oh, it happens, said Knackering Molly firmly. Takes everybody differently, so don't you go making fun, Spindle. Spindle rolled his eyes. I wiped up my mouth and thought somebody pulled my hair back. When I looked, it was my little gingerbread man. He waved. You can't really hug a cookie. I did try. I leaned my cheek against him. What happened to you? I asked. I've been worried sick. I thought the Carracks got you. Spindle rolled his eyes. They may be good with their swords and all, but they ain't got the least idea how to catch a sneak. I got in and got out. Last I saw, those nasty little gingerbread mites were cutting up the ropes on one of the supply tents. Problem is getting back in. He spat on the cobbles. That stupid thief Slug caught me and started telling people I was a spy, not to let me back in the city. Thought it was funny as anything, the great lump. Lucky for him, I came along and convinced Slug otherwise, said Molly mildly. She slapped at Nag's shoulder. Figured I should bring him up here on my own now. City's lost its mind now there's a battle on. I exhaled. My stomach stayed quiet. My cookie was fine. The Spindle was fine. Everybody was... A golem winked out like a dying star. The Golems! I shot upright. There wasn't anything left in my stomach anyway, but even if there had been, I didn't have time to be sick. I had to get back to the Golems. Now. I ran back down the alley. Spindle cursed and ran after me. I could hear Nag's irregular hoofbeats following. I shot out the mouth of the alley and practically into the arms of Aunt Tabitha. Mona, we thought something did happen. Elgar tried to stab me, and Nag saved me. It doesn't matter now. We've lost a golem. We've lost two, said Aunt Tabitha grimly, and before she'd finished speaking, I felt another one fail. They figured out how to knock them over. Then they can't get back up again. We rushed back to the barricade. I grabbed for my bowl of dough, but it was too late. A third golem teetered and fell like a great tree, and Carracks jumped on it, hacking and sawing with swords like blind men trying to slice bread. There were mercenaries coming up the barricades now. Ours was the lowest and least built up of the walls, and they clearly knew it. If they could get over our barricade and tear it down, they wouldn't have to scale any of the others. They'd have a straight shot into the city and could come up behind the defenders on the other streets. I ordered the 4 remaining golems into a wedge defending our barricade. That would buy us time. But time for what? There was still dough left. When they unloaded the wagon, they'd left a half-dozen barrels in neat lines on either side of the street, and that ridiculous coffin from the Church of Sorrowful Angels was laid on top of them. Argonel and Harold stepped back from the barricades. The golems were keeping enough of the Carracks back that the regular guards could handle it. Harold said, Mona, we have to get you away from here. They're going to break through. No, I said. My plan was crystallizing inside my head. It was a terrible plan. What else was new? No, help me empty these barrels. I need as much dough as we can get. But Argonel shoved him aside, grabbed a barrel, and knocked it over. Dough glorped stickily into the street. It wasn't right for bread dough. There was more sugar, and dark brown lumps floated on the surface. Chocolate chip cookie dough? Asked Aunt Tabitha blankly. Who went to all the trouble of making chocolate chip cookie dough? The name on the side of the barrel was one of the most exclusive pastry shops in the city. We dumped out 4 more barrels, and 3 of them were chocolate chip. Well, okay, chocolate chip cookie dough, I can do this. Shouldn't be any more different than bread, just raw. Another golem fell. The roar of triumph from the Carracks crashed over the barrier. I shoved both my hands up to the elbow in the pile of dough and tried to think. Aunt Tabitha and Argonel continued dumping dough around me, made a pile on the street as high as my knees. Not the gingerbread man. Standing upright wasn't going to be much help, and anyway, I would have needed a rolling pin as big as a tree trunk. No, something lower, something legless and oozy. Wake up, I told the dough frantically. Wake up. Get up. We need you. The dough didn't want to. Didn't like the shape I had chosen. It wasn't a real shape. It wasn't baked yet. It was cold and stiff from sitting overnight in the barrels, and it was feeling obstinate. We don't have time for this. Get up! There were too many different doughs all muddled together. They weren't combining. I jumped onto the pile and began stomping around, kneading with my boots. You are one. You are the same. Get up! My gingerbread cookie yanked on my ear. I looked up and saw one of our guards, nobody I knew but one of ours, fall from the top of the barricade. A Carrick stood there with a bloody sword in his hand, and there was no one stopping him. Argonel and Harold leapt up and placed themselves between me and the barricade, but we were out of time. "Get up!" I screamed at the doe. I had so little magic left I couldn't see straight, but I had rage and horror to spare, and I poured it all down my hands into the pile of dough. "Get up, you stupid thing, and fight!" It got up. It was... well, I suppose it was a slug, as much as anything. I tried to think of it as a slug, because the magic works so much better when things are shaped like animals or people, so a slug. A slug with fists. It was only about waist high, but the front pulled itself off the ground and two flailing arms came out, and it slithered across the cobbles towards the barricade and two startled Carracks standing on top of it. "Gods and devils," said nagging Molly. "What have you done, Baker? Go?" "Best I could," I said, and tried to stand up. My knees buckled. I realised with mild surprise that the energy that normally went into making my legs work was now going into animating the chocolate chip slug monster. The slug reached the barricade. Our guards, sensibly, scrambled out of its way. It slimed over the top easily. The dough was sticky enough that it didn't have any problems with the footing, and anyway, it didn't, have feet. One of the Carracks hacked at it with its sword. The sword sank into the dough with a gloop and did not come back out again. The slug lashed out with a tentacle and knocked them both backwards into the square. It wasn't very fast, but it was scary. Still, what could it do against thousands of Carracks? Aunt Tabitha grabbed my shoulder. I swayed under her hand. I'd given too much magic to the dough bird, and it had exploded. If I gave the slug too much magic, it would explode. If I could just get it out into the main body of Carracks, I could pour magic into it, and it would become a giant, mobile bomb. I knew, even as I hung limply in Aunt Tabitha's grasp, that this was the end. I pushed the magic much further than I thought I could, but it was done. If I tried to pour that much of myself into the slug, it would be with the energy that kept me alive. I could send it oozing across the battlefield and blow it up, but that would be the last thing I did. I thought it likely the Golems would keep going for a little while after I died. A few minutes, maybe an hour. Probably not long enough to save the city, but maybe long enough to make a difference. Maybe Aunt Tabitha and Spindle and Argonel would have time to get away. "Get me over to the dough," I choked out. Aunt Tabitha shook her head. You're done. I've seen corpses that look better than you right now, love." I wanted to laugh. In another minute. "That would not be a problem." I have to," I said, forcing the words out. "There's no other wizards left." I tried to crawl forwards. I needed that dough for the magic of sympathy. Why were the barrels so far away? If I couldn't get to the barrels, I couldn't blow up the slug. There was a long pause while Aunt Tabitha wrung her hands. And then nagging Molly slid down off her horse and said, "There's one more wizard. And we'll leave it there."